Welcome back, everyone. Could someone just get the door? I'm going to say a lot of covert things, and I want to make sure that it remains as discreet as possible with the number of iPhones in the room. So I'd first like to begin by introducing Jennifer Ponce de León, who's an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, and who works extensively on art and radical politics in the global South, but also in North America, and has a project that she'll come into the workshop later and talk to us about, particularly a kind of theory of the relationships between social movements and radical artistic practices. But she has quite graciously agreed to come in today because the project that I'm going to talk about and that we're going to generate a discussion around is a project that she's been very integral to, because she knows it from the very beginning, and we've kind of been in dialogue about the articulation of the project itself. And it overlaps in various ways methodologically with her own concerns, even though she's working on a very, very different corpus. And so I thought that she was the perfect person, and took advantage of the fact that she'll be presenting later to ask her to participate in basically a dialogue about this particular project. And what we decided in conversing about how best to unpack some of the things that we're interested in was that I'm going to present about 15 minutes of an outline of what has become a book project, and then out of that kind of generate a conversation and open up and have a kind of broader discussion concerning some of these issues. So I'll just begin with, there are really two major points that I want to highlight. The first concerns subterranean history. You all read, I presume, or at least saw that it was available online, a piece that I wrote in the spring on the CIA reading French theory. And what has come out of that is a concern with a different vision of history than the one that is most prominent, not simply in the academy, but more generally a kind of common sense understanding of history. And that common sense understanding of history is that history is the space in which people try to mark their presence, a kind of hero conception of history, in which ideally what you would do is leave a legacy. You would leave your mark in various ways. And this could be, of course, as an intellectual, but it could also be as a political actor or as a cultural producer or an artist. And what I'm interested in is a type of history whose goal is to never be seen. A subterranean modality of history whose actors want to remain beneath the radar of history. They do not want to participate in or be identified as the heroes of history. But in a very paradoxical and quite pernicious way, they're precisely those who are often the most powerful in the constitution of the visible histories that we have and the legacies that have been left. And so I'd like to understand subterranean in this first sense of a history, or I should say, a series of agencies and actors whose goal is to be consigned to oblivion, who never want to be known. And what they want to be known instead is the result of the work that they have done behind the scenes, producing historical actors, presenting them on the historical stage, and staging, if you will, a history in which they're constantly in the wings, but absolutely invisible. And what's unique about subterranean history, as I'm trying to unpack it, is that it actually operates at both levels, meaning that on the one hand, it's the action of history that is subterranean, meaning that there are actors, agencies, material forces, and whatnot that want to remain hidden. But at the same time, what is coming out of this project is a preoccupation with the ways in which these subterranean forces are primarily interested in burying a particular history and set of legacies and modes of political action. What I mean by that is that in doing some research on the history of particularly the Secret Service and its involvement in the cultural apparatus and the intellectual world, what I've become increasingly interested in is a kind of counter-history of the long 20th century. That instead of taking and accepting the standard narratives regarding the 20th century, the most standard of which would be that there's a march of democracy, the collapse of the socialist alternative, and the kind of progress narrative leading to an end of history and now soon an environmental apocalypse to follow on its heels, that general narrative is premised upon the burial of another history. And the history being buried is the history of not only radical thought, but radical practice and the contestation of global capitalism. And so I want to understand subterranean history as this double movement of the subterranean actors and agencies and material forces that have tried to bury and render subterranean those who actually want to occupy the historical stage in order to transform the world that we're living in into a more egalitarian mode of socioeconomic arrangement, meaning an anti-capitalist left, in short. And so this subterranean history, I think, is related to, and I know that these are, I want to start with these very, very broad claims to situate the analysis of our own historical conjuncture, is directly related to what I would call the crime of the century, and using this language quite consciously, because the crime of the century is usually used to refer to the Holocaust or the gulags in Russia or things like this. But I think that one way of understanding the true crime of the century is the ways in which a series of subterranean forces have, since World War II to the present, largely succeeded in decimating the international cultural left and imposing a certain worldview, which is that there are no options other than perhaps reformist models of tweaking of representational democracy and perhaps green capitalism or things along these lines. Meaning that the crime of the century is not only this burial, but a burial that tries to pass itself off for a natural death or a suicide. Because the standard histories of the radical left in the 20th century tend to situate in terms of either a natural death. People were excited about May 68, and then they grew up and got jobs and cut their hair, just to give you the kind of anecdotal version of it. But more generally, someone or groups of people thought that radical communist experiments in Russia or elsewhere in the world were a good thing, but they learned over time that as soon as you try to radically change the socioeconomic structure, a bloodbath is going to follow. So there's a necessary relationship between revolutionary politics and violence of the most extreme sort. That's the natural death of the left that is often recounted. And if it's not just a natural death, meaning that it was a bad idea to start with, to try to break with the capitalist order, then it's a suicidal narrative in which the Stalino-Maoist orientation of the radical left in the long 20th century led to the left killing itself because the revolutionaries ate their own children. These types of narratives are part of a broader political narratology. And I understand by political narratology the very logic of the histories that we produce and how they are part of the political fabric that is a world, it's the fabric of sense that we make of the world. For this project, then, one of the central focal points is what the Germans call a Weltanschauungskrieg, literally a worldview war. A worldview war in the sense of a war between two worldviews. One is that of a radical left and an appeal to a transformation of the mechanisms of global capitalism. The other worldview is that, as Margaret Thatcher famously claimed, there is no alternative. All that we have is representational democracy and capitalism, and that these will just spread over time. This battle between worldviews, then, I think can best be understood, and this will bring us to then the kind of more immediate world of ideas, was a double operation. And that's why the company, which is what the members internally of the CIA refer to the organization that they're part of, the company has two main branches. One branch is made up of those who are dedicated to the military interventions abroad in order to overthrow largely leftist democratic governments and make sure that global capital is not only protected but imposed upon the people. It's the death arm, if you will, of the CIA. And in case you don't know that history, most people from the global south or elsewhere whose lives have been directly impacted by it know this history. But the United States, since World War II, has overthrown some 50 foreign governments, the majority of whom were democratically elected, dropped bombs on over 30 countries, is involved in and has an extensive network of CIA secret prisons, drone strikes in numerous countries, The list goes on as far as the death machine is concerned. In fact, John Stockwell, who's a former member of the CIA, made a calculation in the 1980s that I think should make us all reflect on what the real crime of the century is. He claimed that of the CIA operations between 1947, at the beginning of the CIA, and the 1980s, amassed a death count, and this is only the immediate death count of the interventions themselves, of 6 million, which is the same as the what some people will call the Jewish communist Holocaust, meaning the Holocaust orchestrated by the Nazi Reich. This included 3,000 major operations and 10,000 minor operations. So this is not some little tiny conspiracy or something like this. It's a major operation. These calculations were in the 1980s. So if you were to stretch them out to today, you'd have to double that number, 12 million. That's the gulags. And then you'd have to add to that the long-term intergenerational consequences of decimating people's lives, the institutional forms of social leftism, and everything that that means. But the death arm of the CIA goes hand in hand with the analyst arm. The analyst arm, or what some people want to call hard and soft power, is the work that follows a very specific logic. And this is at the core of this project. I think that what the death arm of the CIA has tried to do is it's been focused on the idea that you need to kill as many individuals and those organizations of radical leftism as possible. What the analyst branch has tried to do is it's recognized that, well, you still have a problem because you can kill individuals, but as the left loves to say, you can't kill an idea. What the analyst branch has attempted to do is to kill an idea, the idea being that of a radical transformation of society in the name of socioeconomic equality and delinking from capitalism. And if you kill that idea, you can kill a lot more individuals. And so what I'm focused on, because there's been a lot of work on the history of the military intervention of the CIA, is how the CIA and other covert actors, FBI, HUAC, the State Department, the military-industrial complex, a whole series of forces, the Foundation network as well, a lot of the kind of material investments in institutions, has been driven or has aimed at killing an idea, and particularly the idea of a radical left. And it's needed to deploy endless resources in order to do this. And this is a crucially important point, that if the CIA has participated in 3,000 major operations and 10,000 minor operations in the 1980s, this is precisely because the stranglehold of global capitalism is largely, and here I'm thinking of the work of Karl Polanyi, the historian of economics, it's largely because people tend to not enjoy being subjected to the stranglehold of capitalism. Hence the need for massive covert operations in order to impose an idea and make it appear as if that idea was natural. So the natural death of the left, or the suicidal death of the left, goes hand in hand with the natural idea of a march of history in which we're just progressing in a direction of recognizing that capitalism and representative democracy are the only possibilities. And this is all part of an overall attempt to impose global capitalist hegemony orchestrated in and through America. The company, the history of the company is very important. They were Wall Street lawyers, for the most part. They're a part of the power political apparatus that recognized a very unique opportunity at the end of World War II for establishing global hegemony for American-style capitalism and making sure that at every level it was maintained. And largely, I think this will probably come out in the conversation, there's a kind of colonial geography that's operative in which we kill colonial subjects, but the white people at home, we just kill their ideas or we fire them. And that, of course, is variegated. It depends on the individual cases, but is, I think, an important aspect of this. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is plumbing the depths of these intellectual and cultural interventions and the ways in which the Secret Service has manipulated cultural production and circulation at a very profound level since World War II, since its founding in 1947 at the close of World War II. And this is an expansive operation. Hugh Wilford calculated that the CIA, even only in its work in the 1940s and 1950s in Europe, was the biggest supporter of the arts, biggest patron of arts and culture in the history of the world. And that's only the kind of calculations at that point in time. So again, it's not a minor operation. Philosophically then, what this means for me in this project is that I'm interested in a kind of anti-Platonic descent into the cave, which is the dark subterranean cave in which ideas are produced and circulated in the luminous world of the intelligentsia. And so it's anti-Platonic not simply in its intellectual posturing or orientation, but in its practice. Because I want to delve into these deeper material realities. One of the reasons that this is important is because there is a very dominant model of intellectual production that consists in always thinking in individualist terms, where it's individuals who have ideas, and if those ideas are very smart, then they move up in the chain of meritocracy. I think that against that, what's important to recognize is that there's not just a marketplace of ideas and intelligent individuals who rise to the top. There are material conditions that operate in such a way that they produce ideas that become more visible, palpable, circulate in broader horizons for particular reasons, and that those material conditions largely want to remain invisible. And so if you can operate in such a way, and this is precisely what the CIA, the FBI, and other Secret Service agencies have done, is you maintain a long leash policy. So it's not a matter of sending a check to a philosopher or something like that. Instead, it's producing a material situation in which the individual producing the ideas is convinced that they're just part of the meritocracy. Their ideas are becoming popular, they're invited on TV, their work is being translated, there are articles about them in the press, because of the good work that they do. And if you know the details of the extent of the involvement of the Secret Service in the press, they just have, they have direct phone lines to the mass media that are separate phone lines than the other phone lines. They have journalists who, and this has been admitted by the CIA, they admitted, I believe it was in the 60s or 70s, they had dozens of journalists who were just bankrolled by the company, who were working as journalists. That level of control allows you to take someone and make them prominent, while that person thinks that their prominence is simply due to their own intelligence. And in France, one of the things that you see that is very key in this regard, and it brings me more to the kind of counter-history of French and Francophone thought that is important to this project, is the ways in which from World War II to the present, you see among the intelligentsia a general turning away from the radical left. The position of the French intelligentsia at the close of World War II, in part due to the circumstances at that point in time, is they're almost all Marxist communists of some sort, and on the hard left after the literary purges and things like this. Sartre, of course, was the canonical figure in that regard because he quite quickly came out at the end of the war as an engaged and committed Marxist. The relationships to communism and all the details are often complicated, but clear Marxist, and had an enormous reach and political clout and media visibility. He'd go and visit Castro, he went to Russia, he was immediately written up in newspapers. He helped found Libération, which is one of the biggest newspapers in France to date. He represents the epitome of everything that the Secret Service wanted to destroy. And there are numerous documents that label Sartre, that pinpoint him, that identify him as a key problem because he was a very prominent intellectual who maintained a hard left position. They had journalists who were writing articles against him and de Beauvoir. There were smear campaigns. There was an attempt to delegitimate what it was that they were doing. And when you compare Sartre to what happened in the ensuing years, the standard history of French thought that you have is a kind of implicit teleology, where Sartre and existentialism, usually, this is the kind of word on the street when you're not being sophisticated about it, is that, well, they were liberated and it was all about freedom, but kind of naive, and it's a bit for adolescents. Like you read it with Hermann Hesse and you keep it as the thing that kids do. Then the structuralists came along, and the structuralists introduced science, and they were very rigorous about it, and in fact so rigorous that it was a bit too rigid. And so then you needed what is called in the Anglophone world, and is largely an Anglophone invention because you don't really have it in the French world other than as a kind of translated back from the English. You have a post-structuralism, which seeks to then problematize the systemic structures and reveal the ways in which they're actually more fluid, they're open to interpretation, etc. That lineage, implicitly, is always teleological, in the sense that, and this is how an implicit theoretical practice operates. You don't have to say, well, Derrida is the telos of a story that began with Sartre. But most people tend to think that there's a level of sophistication that you get in Derridian deconstruction that is far beyond these naive writings of Sartre he was just sketching out on at a cafe table. Right? So there's a kind of trajectory of greater sophistication and complexification. That, I think, is quite interesting in relationship to what's going on politically, because what happens through this trajectory is a very significant move away from hard leftist positions that you get with the structuralists very early on. Even Foucault is a key case because the CIA identifies him as the most prominent intellectual in France, and so he's very important for them because he was at the Collège de France, had a lot of media visibility. And Foucault, in spite of the radical chic veneer, particularly in Anglophone circles that he has, which sometimes has more to do with leather coats and sexual practices than actual political engagements, his writings are quite clear on the ways in which he thinks that large social movements dedicated to radical transformation lead to, inevitably, modes of violence and dangerous thoughts. He was against mass movements of various sorts. He was critical of the feminist movement. He was critical of the gay liberation movement. You have to read the work and see what his statements are and his positions were. And so the CIA actually identified someone like Foucault and the drift away from a hard leftist position as someone who was much more amenable to what they wanted. And what they wanted was not to control Foucault like a marionette or something like that. What they wanted was an intelligentsia that focused its critical energies on the Soviet Union and not on America. Foucault, Derrida, a lot of those figures of that kind of generation did a very good job of doing precisely that. And as you move on with les nouveaux philosophes, the new philosophers, they're, in many ways, they're kind of media opportunists who are very much aligned on kind of political orientation that is perfectly in tune with what the Secret Service wanted. Because what it's about ultimately is worldviews and what's possible or not possible and what people should be doing with their intellectual energies. And if they're investing their intellectual energies in the critique of global imperialism, that is not good for what the company wants. Because the company is ultimately an attempt to internationalize capitalism. That's its goal, hence the name. It is the company, in the singular. And to do that, there needs to be both a cultural war and a military war, and they go hand in hand. So I'll just conclude on this point, then ultimately, this project is a kind of twofold counter-history. It's an attempt to give a counter-history of the long 20th century and what people refer to as the great hopes of the left at the opening of the century and the dismal collapse at the end of the century, and a world in which there is no socialist alternative, or maybe a little bit somewhere in the world, but nothing of an international sort. To take that on head on, and to look at the way in which that history has been fabricated and the forces that have been mobilized behind it, while at the same time recognizing that an enormous amount of energy had to be put into trying to bury the radical left. And relating that then, more specifically, to a counter-history of the intelligentsia, where the model of intellectual production isn't just some genius coming up with ideas, but instead a material system for the production and circulation of ideas that facilitates certain worldviews and renders other marginalized or structurally impossible in various ways. So I think I'll just wrap up there with the overall framing, and we can pick up from that.
Okay. Well, I want to start with a kind of, I think, a devil's advocate kind of question, which is this not giving too much agency, historical agency to the agency per se, or to statecraft? This kind of idea that, does this lend itself to a kind of model of history that there are these puppeteers, basically, that we can identify with a kind of defined state project, and that is the motor driving history? And does that not, really efface the kind of agency of all different all different other forces, other social locations. And is this, I think, the kind of vulgar version of that type of reading would say, well, this is just a conspiracy theory. I mean, that's the kind of model of what people tend to use to describe what a conspiracy theory might be.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I would say a few things. One is that my approach to analyzing social forces in general is in terms of a multi-agential analysis. There's never a single agency in history, and agencies always operate relationally and constitute themselves through their articulation with other agencies. So these models of history and these social models that you tend to get where it's all top down, or it's just the people and it's bottom up, or there's an agent of revolutionary transformation that will be singular, like the working class or whatever else it might be, are all, I think, extremely impoverished social models. So that's just the first methodological point that I'd like to make. But then secondly, when people dismiss these types of concerns as being a conspiracy theory, one of the reasons for that is, I think, the atomistic conception of intellectual production. The assumption is that, well, if this happens, then it must be that some intellectual is just being bought off to make a certain idea or produce a certain idea. But that's precisely not how it operates. How it operates is creating material institutions and possibilities that foreclose certain ways of working, certain ideas. If you want to do a Marxist analysis of economics and be hired at Harvard in the economics department, have your work cut out for you. Because the material conditions are such that there's a foreclosure. It's not even an exclusion. You're foreclosed from doing that because the exclusion has always already happened in such a way that you can't even see that it's happening. That's one thing that I like to say, but another very important point about conspiracy theory is that this is a term that's used by spin doctors in order to delegitimate anyone who's critical of a particular system. As soon as someone calls into question power structures, one of the things that the spin doctors love to do is use the term of conspiracy theory to kill the messenger. Instead of simply saying, oh, that's an interesting idea, why don't we investigate the historical record? Because through the Freedom of Information Act, most of this information is actually out there. The CIA has admitted to endless bloodbaths around the world. We have all the documents, or a lot of the documents. But instead of doing that, labeling something as a conspiracy theory is you kill the messenger. It's just because that person's crazy, because they think that they have this paranoid vision of the world, that the powers that be actually want to exercise that power indiscriminately. Which ultimately leads me to a final point, and that is that that's not that crazy of an idea. That the powers that be would want to use that power indiscriminately. The real conspiracy is the idea that capitalist governments, because that's generally what we have, are interested in spreading freedom around the world and helping people help themselves. That's the real conspiracy. Like, believing that is believing in the most radical of conspiracy theories, because the entire historical record goes against it.
Okay. I want to also talk a bit more about what you were talking about as the kind of the story about the suicide of the radical left.
Yeah.
And I mean, because this is, I think we see all different kinds of versions of this, whether it's, I mean, this is the kind of classical argument that's always thrown up, well, what about Stalin? What about, any kind of, anything, on one hand, that manifests itself oftentimes in the kind of moralization of any kind of violence, and also the bracketing of considerations about the historical context in which states or movements try to carry out projects of radical social transformation. But how do we really take seriously the critiques of leftist projects?
Yeah, that's great. I think that one of the most important things to do, and this honestly comes from your work, because you really insisted on this in the work that you've done, is recognizing that one of the enormous strengths of the left, and by left I should clarify, I mean anti-capitalism. I do not mean the way in which the left is defined in the media. The left is defined in the media in terms of pro-capitalist parties that are situated basically on the center right when you think of the broad political spectrum. So I have an understanding of the history of politics that understands leftism as it's defined in the last 200 years is anti-capitalism. That one of the enormous legacies of that tradition is self-critique. A great example of this is all of the debates at the very emergence of Marxist political economy and anarchism and the International was radical critiques of the left, by the left, and for the left. And that is crucially important. And I think that that needs to continue and needs to be recognized as precisely what the left does that the right doesn't do. The right is not interested in self-critique. There isn't a legacy of self-critique of the right in the same sense of the left. And so I think that in the case of Stalin, in the case of Mao, or other such instances, of course, we need to look at the historical record and identify where things either went wrong or problems that we wouldn't want to repeat, and that there are many of them. Instead of, there's a kind of, China Mieville has a good line on this where he talks about it being a politics of the aphorism, I believe is the expression he uses. And the politics of the aphorism is you say things like, oh, revolutionaries eat their children, or vice versa. And you have this little idea that's supposed to sound smart because you heard like big people saying it, and so you repeated it at a dinner party. But actually, it's just a stopgap for thought. And what it means is this is something that I've heard before as a way of just delegitimating and not looking at the historical record. So it's precisely that type of stopgap for thought that needs to be avoided in the name of radical self-critique. And maybe just a final thing I'd say about this, and that is the question of violence is absolutely central, because there's a way in which violence, as it's been conceptually and aesthetically formatted within the contemporary world and the media apparatus, is always the violence of resistance, the violence of those who are pushing back against a system that's trying to destroy their lives. Instead of recognizing the violence inherent within the systems that are being imposed and the counter-revolutionary violence that's constantly unleashed. And you have to recognize in any revolutionary conjuncture that you never make your own revolution, because there's always people elsewhere who are meddling in that revolution, who are attempting to infiltrate in various ways, and that the counter-revolutionary violence needs to be identified as such. So there's not the moralizing gesture of, oh, well, people rose up and they were trying to change society, and look, now it's all bad. Like some of the narratives that you get about Egypt, for instance, as if any consequence from a revolutionary action that would follow, including the counter-revolutionary violence, is blamed on those who are trying to transform the world in the direction of greater, or of delinking from capitalism. And so I think it's a really crucial point.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, to build a bit on what you were talking about, the politics of the aphorism, and the ways that the implicit, the attack on the left often happens, sometimes happens through these kind of, you know, aphoristic models, and oftentimes it is buried and it's implicit, as you were mentioning, right? Where the very fact that what's happening is a battle between worldviews is itself made invisible. That battle, that there's even another option, is obfuscated, but that this attack happens under the ideological cover of all of these other types of critiques. And you talked a bit about how that has happened with French theory, with this kind of fetish of sophistication, this sort of idea that, well, something is more theoretically complex, therefore it's a better idea. I think we see that oftentimes as the idea that certain materialist traditions are somehow vulgar and compared, that it's always more complicated. I think there's also these, which you mentioned, also the way that this implicit attack kind of marshals other types of ideologies of historical progress, biological maturation, kind of moral economies, moral critiques, the idea that something is just anachronistic now, like that meant something in the past, it no longer does, we've been beyond that. I think I'm thinking now that, like with Latin America, the discourse of corruption has been used so much for, a critique of the left, but it's never happening under the idea of an actual attack, a discursively explicit attack on egalitarian politics.
Right.
So I wanted to just think a bit more about all, in other places, kind of other times, how do we see that happening?
That's really great, because there are ways in which there are frontal attacks on, when you look at what should be called the Red Purge, and the Black and Red Purge for that matter, rather than the Red Scare in the United States, because it wasn't a scare, it was purge. And we should be clear about the terminology that we use, because the spin doctors have invented that terminology to suggest other things, that those are frontal attacks, and they're ongoing. These have not changed, particularly now when you see the assault on professors within the academy whose political opinions are being questioned by a group of right-wing ideologues in order to put pressure on the university to fire them or to relieve them of their duties temporarily. Those frontal attacks, I think, are definitely operative, but what I really like about your question is it's also that there are other ways of doing that tend to massage worldviews in particular ways. And I think a very powerful aspect of that is precisely narratology and historical narratology. The way in which there are narratives about history that are constructed that tend to operate implicitly, that you don't really question because they're just part of the inherited discourse. So one of the ones that you highlighted, and I think that this is really central, is the idea that what we're doing now, or what is happening now, is definitely somehow more developed than what was going on earlier. And that everything related to, think about the expression working class. It just sounds old. I don't know how the spin doctors and ideologues succeeded in doing that, but working class labor struggles sounds ancient. And there's a way in which there's a temporal moralism, if you will, that's operative, in which values are attached to particular practices and orientations precisely in order to bury them in history, which comes back to this kind of subterranean question. There are different types of burial, but one type of burial is a historical burial in which you make everything about the radical left sound like it's from yesteryear. In the French context, this has been a constant assault because it's the '68 generation. In America, or in American context, it's more the hippies. And there are all of these implicit narratives that go into this that usually have to do with maturation, intellectual sophistication, recognizing and coming to terms with what is actually possible instead of being lost in the naive ideas of youth. And I think it's fascinating that there's a kind of short circuit between a biological narrative and a historical narrative. Because ultimately it's the same basic story of maturation. That's one of the reasons that the CIA, they're kind of obsessed with, they love to work with political exiles, and particularly those who are former Marxists. Nobody better. The nouveaux philosophes are considered former Marxists, and we put a lot of quotes around this, but they were declared kind of aligned on a hard left position, and they're reformed Marxists. So they know the Kool-Aid, they drank it, and they realized that it was actually blood, and they grew up and shed their earlier views. And you see this in intellectual production very clearly, because there's a whole series. It's not only that, well, deconstruction is just inherently more sophisticated, and its politics are about a kind of level of interrogation that supersedes any historical conjuncture, because it's about the history of Western metaphysics. It's not just about labor struggles. And so that, I think, plays a very key role, but it's also that there's a kind of distribution of the intellectual world in terms of what is passé and what is cutting edge. And this is the neoliberal temporalization of the intellectual economy. We should recognize it for what it is. The fashion industry is the theory industry. These operate according to the exact same logic. When somebody says, oh, what's the latest French theory? Or, oh, maybe we'll go to the critical theory workshop and we'll meet this really trendy stuff. Sorry to disappoint. Really, really early on. Everybody was thinking they'd meet the next greatest French philosopher. But lo and behold, I think we have to recognize those for their historical narratives that are economic narratives, that are premised on the idea that the cutting edge is what is fashionable now, what is salable now, what is hot, and a lot of times what is hot is juxtaposed to what is not, and what is not tends to be people like Marcuse. Marcuse is really not cool. Marcuse sounds like just this old guy. CIA and the FBI were following really closely. He worked for the OSS, which was the predecessor organization for the CIA. So that way of distributing things implicitly has an enormous political impact. Because what's great about it is you don't see it happening to you. You don't see it happening. That's part of the long leash policy as well. The long leash is the dog thinks it's free. It's running around, doesn't even see it. It's just acting freely. And lo and behold, if it goes a little too far, it's going to be jerked back. Yeah.
Well, just to build on that, because you also do so much work on aesthetics and the arts, how does that, I mean, if we're thinking, how does that operate when we're thinking about cultural production beyond intellectual production, but we think about cultural production more broadly and the way that kind of leftist cultural production also suffers these same kinds of, delegitimation, the idea is that it's anachronistic, but always under, never with the attack on its politics, or almost never. I mean, that happens too, but I think there's so many other ways that that's implicitly manifested.
Yeah, because you render it historical, right? It's a historical burial, if you will. But no, the broader question of cultural production, ultimately that's what this research comes out of, because the reason I first got interested in the Secret Service and its involvement in cultural production is based on kind of a research project on art and politics in which I came to recognize that the promotion of the art of the Americas at the close of World War II was completely orchestrated by the Secret Service working with the private museum industry and the power brokers of the New York-Washington consensus, if you will. And that they really were integral for moving the cultural capital of the world from Paris to New York. And it took a little bit of time, but it was a massive endeavor at a material level that then creates a different image of the world, and the image that they wanted to promote is precisely America is this land of freedom and possibility. These poor artists and cultural producers in Europe don't have opportunities. You still have it today. They don't have opportunities there. America's so much more flexible. You can move up the social ladder more quickly. It's a bigger country. Like all of these things that go into a certain image of America being a free country, and that the cultural production is part of that. I mean, there are other, maybe I'll come back at you, because there are other more specific and pointed examples that I could highlight. But what did you have in mind, particularly about cultural production?
Well, I was thinking, for example, of one of the ways that the CIA was involved, for example, in influencing Latin American literary production. It had to do with funding literary journals that were very prestigious, but the idea was that they promoted a kind of a universal art. And that was seen as much more valuable than the particularistic art that had an explicit political content. And this is always, playing out with the kind of, in a very broad sense, the juxtaposition of Soviet realism with any kind of work that then, that of course is particular in its, aesthetics, cultural context, etc., but that lays claim to and is promoted as laying claim to a universally valuable, a universal aesthetic. And, also the idea that an art that has an explicit politics is somehow degraded.
Yeah, exactly, because somehow it would be inscribed within a particular tradition instead of being part of the universal, if you will.
Yeah, but that's always the kind of, even the recognition of it being particular is completely contingent, because people don't talk about Hollywood films, for all of their promotion of U.S. militarism as having a particular politics, right? But when it does come to talking about work that deals with race or work that deals with, class or social struggles, that is read as being particular, and then the kind of its value then is brought into question.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really important, because the orientation of the CIA, particularly in the early years of the Cold War, was to valorize free and autonomous, key word for them, they use it regularly, autonomous cultural production, as a way of providing a space for a kind of cultural international production. And constantly, at that point in time, of course, juxtaposing this to the Soviet Union, social realism and whatnot, and really seeking to have artists whose work wasn't being shown or couldn't be shown in the communist countries integrated in, and they'd organize concerts and have shows in order to have all the exiled, or some of them, exiled artists and musicians and whatnot. And what's quite fascinating about that is a number of things. One is that in the name of freedom and autonomy, of course what you have is a heteronymous construction of autonomy. One of the great paradoxes of this is the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an organization set up by the CIA in, it was based in Paris. It had offices in 35 countries. It was enormous in its cultural expansiveness, and they have their charter or manifesto. It's all about artistic autonomy and freedom, which is precisely what they want to promote. And so the packaging and selling of freedom and autonomy as a space in which one could express oneself, while all of that is actually part of an ideological war of worldviews. That's one of the reasons, because I looked extensively at abstract expressionism in the post-war era. It's a fascinating case because many of those artists were pretty strong leftists in the interwar period, and then are usually identified as being apolitical, with the exception of Ad Reinhardt a bit and some of the others. But the work is just kind of masculinist expressivity. But what the company recognized was an opportunity to valorize purportedly apolitical art as the freedom of expression, the manifestation of an individualist ethos that you could do anything in America, and that its apoliticity, its lack of politics, is precisely what allowed them to use it for political ends. So that type of paradoxical relationship is quite interesting. Just quickly as an anecdote, which I've always found quite fascinating, there's a text that Adorno wrote on the autonomy of art that was then published in a German journal that was run by the State Department. And Horkheimer pointed it out to him. He said, you know, that might be a bit shady because I know how that journal works, but Adorno just wanted to get the article out. And so then you have this nesting effect where somebody's laying claim to the autonomy of art, of course theorized in a very specific sense in Adorno, but then encapsulated within a journal that wanted to promote the autonomy of art, but for very different ends. And so you have fascinating phenomena like that. Like the member of the Frankfurt School who was working for the OSS, the predecessor organization for the CIA, who was actually working simultaneously for the KGB. So there's quite fascinating and intriguing stories that come out in some of this research. But sorry, that's more anecdotal.
Okay, well, to move on, I want to talk about ask you to talk a bit more about precisely what you think the political role of intellectuals is, and also cultural producers, perhaps, more broadly, if you'd like to comment about that. But also, why are we taught to, think that we're actually not? I mean, there's so many discourses about intellectuals, just ivory tower, disconnected. I mean, even some of the debate, recent things that have been happening within the U.S. about political attacks on leftist intellectuals. There's also been a kind of discourse saying, well, academics don't matter anyway. Nobody cares what we do. Same thing about artists, right? That this is just inconsequential work that we do. But you're talking, clearly that there's an enormous investment being put in intellectual production and cultural production as a state project with a very specific political end. So could you just talk a bit more about how you're thinking of the political role?
That's great. I think that one thing that comes out of this research that I find quite fascinating is that the most powerful organization in the history of the world, because the company is by far the most powerful organization, financially, militarily. I don't think there's anything that rivals it. Its resources, its budget, its involvement in global narco-trafficking, it is an extraordinary powerhouse. That they are invested in and interested in and writing analyses and reports on intellectual production, maybe be a sign to us that some people think it's important. And if they think it's important, I think that then we have to come to terms with why is that the case. And I think it's perhaps first and foremost, because there are different aspects to this, but first and foremost, the way in which the intelligentsia provides for the credentialization of worldviews. And you can say that this worldview is valid and this one is not. Like, the world is flat, doesn't seem very valid these days. The world is round, okay, we can work with that. The attempt to then understand and, with a long leash, control and manipulate a shift of worldviews from a very strong anti-capitalist intelligentsia and set of cultural producers at the end of World War II. And I should just say and remind all of us very quickly, the United States allied with Stalin during World War II in order to fight the Germany and Italy and the other countries. And in doing so, in many ways, historically, it was the only possibility of winning the war. Of course, the US loves to tell these grandiose stories about D-Day and whatnot. If Russia was not involved, most historians recognize World War II would not have been won. So in the immediate post-war era, what you have is a massive empowerment in the intelligentsia and among cultural producers of a communist orientation. And most of the intelligentsia in Europe was oriented towards, the Communist Party in France at the close of World War II was the strongest party. And the project then, if we look back on it historically, is taking a kind of communist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist worldview that dominated cultural producers, decimating it. You have to lob it off from the center left, which is another part of the discussion we haven't really gotten to. The room's so hot, I don't know if we'll get there. Sorry, it's a little stuffy in here. But you lob it off, you delegitimate it, and then you redefine the left as the center left and as the representational left. That onslaught is something that, if you trace it out up to the present, you can very easily see that there's a real radical shift in worldviews. And in the academy today, the dominant political position is liberalism. Liberalism is not anti-capitalism. Liberalism in the sense of political liberalism, the tradition defined kind of coming out of Locke and others, which we should know is the political project that went hand in hand with the global slave trade, imperialism, colonial genocide, indigenous, on and on and on. Like, that project is not somehow holding these other projects at arm's length. Domenico Lusordo's Liberalism, A Counter-History is fantastic in going through and showing that it's not just a contradiction that these happen, but liberalism it's an imperial project. And it's a state formation that is premised on a whole series of things: European superiority, private ownership, etc. And so I think that cultural producers are extremely important precisely because of their power for establishing worldviews, at least two different levels. One is the intellectual production. And if you write books where you suggest that there are only certain options that are on the table, and that's your mode of analysis, then you've done a great service to people who want that idea spread. But also formatting all of the students who come through, and who would take, for instance, a political philosophy or a political science class, and come out of it thinking, well, there's a Democratic Party and there's a Republican Party, and those are the political options, because that's how the party system operates. If you can succeed in doing that, generation upon generation upon generation, you've completely killed the worldview that would open up to very, very different horizons. And I just say as a final note, the expansiveness of the engagement of the Secret Service is extraordinary. Involvement with the women's movement, the student movement, journalism, the mass media, religion, it goes on and on and on. The Catholic Church, it's very, very expansive. Because to control and manipulate, just to come back to this earlier idea, the idea is you kill an idea. And that idea is the dangerous thought of a socioeconomic mode of organization that is anti-capitalist. And to kill that, you really have to rip it out at all of its roots, and the intelligentsia plays a crucial role in that. Particularly in France, where the intelligentsia has a lot more political visibility. There are often philosophers who are in government and things like this, and media visibility. on radio shows, TV, and whatnot. But in the States as well, it's just a different level of engagement.
Well, in terms of thinking about the extensiveness of this project, we've talked about the CIA's involvement internationally. How does this relate to what's going on domestically at the same time?
Well, the distribution of roles, at least traditionally, was that the FBI would be on the home front, what the CIA was internationally, but of course, defining what that means is always a subject of debate. The FBI, in many ways, was involved in the same project. The main goal was to kill the radical left domestically, and to literally kill, I think the stats are by Ward Churchill, 29 members of the Black Panthers and 69 members of the American Indian Movement were assassinated by the FBI, which is the same as the kind of colonial wars, just at a different level in a different way. If somebody, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's right around there. Usually they'd have henchmen do their work, so they'd have the Chicago police killed Fred Hampton, but it's the FBI organized all of it and set it all up, and they have an FBI informant who made a drawing of Fred Hampton's apartment so the Chicago police would know exactly where he was and how to kill him. So that type of thing was going on in the same way, and COINTELPRO, as we know, but the continuation of COINTELPRO was a massive documentation of everything the left was doing, and it's extraordinary. Particularly the attack on the Black radical tradition. I find it mind-boggling because they infiltrated all of the Black Panthers, of course, but then all the jazz clubs. They literally there's a former FBI informant who infiltrated a lot of the Black radical movements. There's a great interview with him on YouTube. I would put it on the top of my list if I were you, because it's fascinating. And one of the things that he talks about is the extent to which the FBI knew Black cultural production in the United States much better than he did or any of his friends did. Because they studied it as a way of, and this is also Hoover, but you have to know everything about a person. What they eat, where they move, what their fecal matter looks like, literally everything. So at a moment's notice, you can manipulate them in various ways. Their sexual preferences, where they are at 11 p.m. on Saturday night, and they have these enormous files. And of course, one of the great stories of COINTELPRO is that it was 3 people in Media, Pennsylvania, and people from Villanova probably know Media, who broke into an FBI office, took the files, and mailed them to the people whose files they were. And that's how the whole story broke. So it's an extraordinary story. And they never discovered them until very recently through the statute of limitations they've come out. One of whom was a professor at Temple University, which is quite interesting. It's just whatever local. But I think it's the same. You have the company internationally, and you have the bureau domestically. Same project at different levels. There are conflicts between them and whatnot at various points in time. It's the same project.
I mean, and I think the impact on intellectual life, in addition to the political culture of the U.S., because of the evisceration of those movements is enormous. If you imagine having people who are intellectuals and activists around, could have potentially really changed a lot of discourses on race, on racial capitalism within the U.S.
Imagine if we had members of the Black Panthers who were regularly part of the intelligentsia in the United States today.
Yeah.
Be extraordinarily different. Most of them were killed or incarcerated or exiled.
Yeah.
And that's an entire generation of radicals. And for each one individual, we have people like Angela Davis today. If you imagine, like 600 Angela Davises, that's really would be a very powerful mode of change. And that's precisely why they did the work that they did, and continue to do that kind of work. Which is, because I just have my eye on time, I think maybe we should get to, because we had talked about maybe just touching a bit on the contemporary situation. And because we also want to open up a little bit and air out the room a little bit. But I know that you had a question related to the contemporary situation.
How some of the ways, the kind of material practices that this assault on the radical left is happening now, happening in the kind of post-Cold War era moment, where the kind of even among my students, the idea of anti-communism itself seems really anachronistic. But part of the power of that is that it's so materially embedded, right? So what are some of the ways that you're seeing that this is operating
Yeah.
now, and perhaps not in the same kind of frontal attack
Yeah.
that we see during the Cold War era.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fascinating things, and given the research that I've done, and that's often a question that I get, what about, that was back in the day. So you actually have the same
Yeah.
time of the now historiography that structures this. Like, oh, there were these bad battles and they were killing Black Panthers, but now we live in these modern times in which everybody's free and there are, people, now there are Black Studies departments, so we'd be, I guess, post-racial or I don't know what, or how those narratives play themselves out. But I think that there are two really important things to recognize. One is that the frontal onslaught continues. It's taken on different forms, but definitely continues, precisely because the frontal onslaught is part of, it's establishing material relations that allow for particular modes of intellectual production and foreclose others. And those systems are very well in place. But the second thing is that one of the legacies of this basically intergenerational decimation of the radical cultural left is that when the institutions that we have are transformed at such a deep level to move things from a space in which radical politics was part of the discussion, but also part of the actions, to a situation in which it's largely been delegitimated at an institutional level. It really is, to come back to this vocabulary, it's a foreclosure. Because now, when you go to the university and you have these different classes, and people will complain about, oh, the neoliberalization because of this, that, or the other thing, but what's really difficult to see is that actually there's a structural set of conditions that have been sedimented over time that produce a reality of what higher education is. And that process of historical sedimentation means that you don't actually see the exclusions because they've been foreclosed. They happened in the basement of history and they're already done with. The radical Marxists were chased out of the country. Any of them that did end up getting university positions ended up being in comp lit departments or in women's studies departments or things like this as a mode of delegitimation, because then we know it's just kind of poetic or made up, but it's not rigorous and scientific. The economics departments are basically all neoliberal. But then also the funding structures and how they operate, the funding being driven basically by research and development. I remember Chomsky calculated that MIT at one point in time, 90% of its funding came from the military. So people talk about the ivory tower, have no clue. The ivory tower is a complete myth and an ideological construct. Research and development is the way in which the military mobilizes intellectual energy for the production of the engineering needs and the technological needs of the death machine, which is the military apparatus. That's how these things operate. And in our day and age, I think we have to recognize that it's largely the successes of those battles over years to transform the material conditions of intellectual production and circulation that have left us with institutions that are so impoverished. And that goes hand in hand with the massive precarization of higher education in general and its vocationalization, in which the basic goal of systems of higher education today is social reproduction of the managerial classes. And to do it in such a way that the managerial classes usually are just trained in the kind of techno-scientific modes of expertise that are necessary for them to play a role as a kind of cog in this larger capitalist machinery. There's lip service paid to critical thinking. There are attempts to kind of provide a supplement of the soul so that before working as a banker on Wall Street, you can read a bit of Tolstoy. But these are not, there's not a bastion of radical cultural production that is trying to mobilize forces in a different way. And the problem is that it's not legible. And when it becomes legible, often then it becomes individualized. So you have individual intellectuals who have a radical chic veneer, or who, oh wow, that person's a real hard leftist, and that's kind of interesting. And this ultimately leads to the larger stakes of this project, which is, it's by no means defeatist. On the contrary, it's recognizing that intellectual and cultural producers have an enormous power for constructing worldviews. And that a lot of that has either been taken away from us or hijacked. But endless resources have been deployed in order to do that. Endless resources. Because it's very labor intensive. And so it's much more a call to arms to take that back up, but to do it in such a way that it's a collective enterprise that's about forging counter-institutions that allow for a broader space of resonance for a cultural left. Because one way of understanding the positive project, I have a friend who told me this in jest, who said, oh, well, I get it. Look at everything the CIA has dismantled and rebuild that. And if you could do that, that'd be great. Because you know exactly what it is that they found to be dangerous. Black Panther Party, American Indian movement, radical indigenous movements, autonomous movements, land movements, etc.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
I mean, I think, because this is, I just want to go a little bit farther on this. Bearing in mind, we've talked a lot about the importance of paying attention to the material conditions of intellectual production. And you've also talked a lot about the social production of knowledge. In other words, the production of knowledge being a social practice against this kind of atomized ideas of individual thinkers. So with those, in the forefront of our minds, how do we go about fomenting, building a radical cultural left?
Well, I think there's a number of things. One is that you have to consider that intellectual production should not simply be confined to individual labor. In fact, that's precisely what the system wants, is individual laborers who's can produce surplus value, basically. And instead, that if we understand that labor as one that can be collective, and also that is oriented towards institution building, because institutions are ways of federating between multiple agencies and gaining much more leverage over a given situation than one could ever do individually. Because the attack on the radical left is an attempt to atomize the radical left. First you lob it off from the rest of the left, and then you try to, if you've ever looked at the FBI records on this, it's fascinating. They were constantly sending fake letters to various members of the black radical tradition, lying to other black members of the black radical tradition to try to foment dissent between them, and sometimes succeeded, because people thought they were real letters, and that there were arguments that were built out of that. Anything we can do to work against that atomization, and to recognize that there needs to be a broad strategy of anti-capitalism, within which there are many different tactics, and that institution building is a way of actually producing spaces in which you can have much more leverage, and also spaces that can bracket some of the exigencies of the broader world. I mean, I wouldn't want to over self-aggrandize what I've been trying to do with the critical theory workshop, but as a micro institution, it is definitely related to this type of project. Because I could just be hanging out in Paris myself, reading books, and it would be probably less labor intensive, there would be more oxygen in the room, and things like this. But the opportunity to create spaces where something more than just individual intellectual production can happen, I think is crucially important. Those who work as journalists, who do book series, who are doing intellectual production, who are federating with others in order to move things in a particular direction, it's extremely powerful. And you usually don't realize the extent to which it's powerful. Because imagine if we just had different institutions. Imagine if everything you ever wanted and everything you wanted to do, there was an institution for that. And it was already there, and there's all these other people who are already doing it. It'd be fantastic. And so, I mean, a very self-aggrandizing claim would be, well, hopefully this would be that space. I don't want to, I think that we probably won't get quite that far, but anything that we can do to build those types of institutions, I think, is crucially important. Do we want to, I didn't realize that it was going to be as warm as it is. The other room that we're going to be in next week and the following week is air conditioned, but here I'll bring in fans next time to help ventilate. Do we want to open up for some questions, comments? I mean, I think we do, but it's just a matter of whether or not people are going to, or people are still awake. Yeah, okay. So, yeah.
Well, just one thing to bring it up to current day. I mean, you mentioned that the CIA was perhaps the most powerful organization around. I'm thinking of another one that's quite powerful as well that has come to light recently, which is the NSA.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how that plays into that. Have you looked at that, their role, especially considering, today, what we know from today's modern technology, the surveillance state and all that. To what extent do they play a role in all of this. And I think their budget perhaps doesn't quite reach the CIA's, but it comes very close, if I remember correctly. And combined, of course, we have to keep in mind that in today's day and age, it's not just the NSA. The NSA has access to Google, to Facebook, to all these other resources that just increase their power exponentially.
Yeah.
So how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, no, that's great. Just an idea, why doesn't somebody crack the door and open up the other door that's by the elevator, by the stairs? Because the issue is not the sound, obviously. It's the amount of oxygen in the room. And make sure those windows are open out there, because hopefully that way there'll be at least a little bit of ventilation, and we can keep ourselves going. No, that's a really great question. The NSA is a fascinating organization, and of course it is kind of a black site in comparison to the CIA, because less is known about it. It's quite obscure in its own involvements. But I would say at least two things. One is that given the radical transformations in surveillance technologies, the NSA is playing an increasingly important role because of the direct access, particularly as we know through the Snowden revelations, through to so much information. And so you don't need to tail anyone these days. You don't, and you can, all of these devices, I mean, it would be very easy to be listening to us right now. I'm actually really certain that they are, because of the way in which you can follow the tracking of websites and whatnot. And there are CIA headquarters that are in certain locations. And when those locations come up regularly, it's probably because somebody's checking in who's an analyst. And so that does change things quite considerably. And the NSA, I think, plays a crucial role in that. And its relationship to the corporatocracy. Because ultimately, thinking in terms of, there's the state and then there are economic actors, I think is a very false model. There's the corporatocracy, and within the corporatocracy, there are different branches. There are the corporate entities themselves, Google, Facebook, and whatnot. And then there are those kind of state actors who work with them and facilitate things for them, but also invest in them. It goes both ways. The CIA and the FBI, Hoover wanted to make the FBI autonomous, so there's endless investments in Wall Street. And those investments are protected by making sure that global politics unfolds in such a way that those companies benefit. And so it's a really tightly knit system that is extremely integrated. Cultural warfare, I think, is a bit different for the NSA, at least as far as I can tell in the research that I've looked at. The CIA is invested in, they call it cultural warfare and psychological warfare. It's a war on ideas. And this has been an extensive project since day one in 1947. But the NSA isn't quite as involved in that in the same way. So that's mainly why I've been focusing more on CIA and FBI. If people know resources, though, I'd be very interested, because this is also a kind of nascent project. It has taken on a kind of exponential shape very, very quickly, because I was working on some other things, and then this has kind of ballooned. So I'd be interested if people have other resources. Ian, Jasmine?
So I have a question that's kind of related to the first question that was asked about conspiracies and stuff like that. So in answering that question, you were talking about how you were interested in a multi-agential analysis, so you want to understand the ways in which agencies and material bodies kind of interact with one another all the time. So I'm wondering about the emphasis, like with that in mind, on the company, singular, the company, right? And I have a specific difference, actually, that seems to be present that maybe you're glossing over, right? Because you talk about, you also lump in the Secret Service with the CIA. And the Secret Service is, a lot of what they do is very visible, actually. Like the Secret Service is has huge motorcades, and they'll hold up like a whole neighborhood in Washington, D.C. for a couple minutes as they go by. And everybody kind of knows that they have amazing guns inside all of those trucks and stuff, and they could kill anybody if they wanted to at any point. So I'm wondering, to what extent is talking about the company as one thing, not always risking falling into kind of this conspiracy way of looking at things, where when you're talking about an invisible history, actually there are types of visibility that the CIA but also all the other agencies interacting with it are also propagating at the same time.
You're going to jump in? No? No, that's great. I think that the reason that I find it quite fascinating that the CIA refers to itself as the company in its internal lingo is because it really pinpoints the way in which the goal of the CIA, and I think this is how we should understand that abbreviation, is it's capitalism, internationalization agency. That's what the CIA does, and that's the central strategic goal that unifies the company. But of course, particularly within the structure of the company, it doesn't function at all in terms of singular agencies. In fact, it's structured like a terrorist organization. A terrorist organization is in terms of a series of compartmentalized networks that might overlap a bit, but many of which are actually disconnected from others. And even the hierarchies are such that there's not oversight over all of the different activities. This is, as terrorist organizations, it's set up for the same reason, is that, well, if this so-called bad apple down here does something and gets caught, then you have plausible deniability for the other people involved in the organization, and it doesn't take the whole organization down. And so it's not only that it's multi-agential, I think that social phenomena in general are multi-agential, and I've tried to develop a kind of theoretical model for that. But more specifically, it's structured like a terrorist organization, such that there is no center to the CIA. So I think your point is very, very well taken. And yeah, the Secret Service, all of these, the other organizations, if we want to separate them out, do function differently. What I'm interested in is trying to understand how many of them coalesce around the same strategic goal, and there are many different tactics that are used to reach that goal. And one of the tactics is visibility. In fact, when it was discovered that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a CIA front organization, Congress for Cultural Freedom, all of the presidents, the honorary presidents, were philosophers, and they were some of the most prominent philosophers. Bertrand Russell, Karl Jaspers. These are very prominent people who were publicly revealed to have been working for a CIA organization. And it came out at a moment in time at which it had been discovered that certain journals were being directly funded, leftist journals, but more center-left than hard-left, by the CIA. And there was a member of the CIA, Tom Braden, who wrote a famous piece in which he kind of revealed that it was indeed the case that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a front organization. It's very possible that that was part of, there's a strategy that's used, it's the Guantanamo Bay strategy, where you give a toothpick in order to hide the forest of toothpicks. So you say, yeah, Guantanamo Bay, let's focus on this. Who's talking about the CIA secret prison network? We have a map of it. It's enormous. And so it's a kind of focal point, and that politics of visibility, I think, is crucially important. So thank you for highlighting. Others? Jasmine?
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you would categorize the politics of post-structuralism beyond the individual members, and beyond the negative critique toward Marxist theory, because it doesn't seem like you want to call them leftists. It seems like you're putting them in contradistinction to some theory of leftism that's immediately informed by Marxist theory. And I ask because it seems like post-structuralism is not responsible in part for killing the idea so much as transforming it. And that idea of a leftist critique that's critical to something like the NSA is represented in contemporary mass movements. So like see the influences of Foucault and contemporary queer theory and practice. And that doesn't really seem like a death of an idea, but a development and transformation of it.
I think there's a lot packed into your question. It would take a while, but I never want to establish a singular or one-to-one relationship between a figure, such as Foucault, or a movement, or a non-movement for that matter, and one politics. These are very complex phenomena, and I've analyzed and written extensively on a lot of those details. That being said, I think that it is important to this project to question and take distance from standard implicit political narratives, and to recognize the political positions that are taken by particular figures, like Derrida's position on May 68. It's kind of a frenzy of, uprisings and whatnot, but he wasn't in the streets. He wasn't supportive. It wasn't an act of. It was a bit vulgar because it's at that lower level of material realities instead of the history of Western metaphysics and our battle against the history of Western metaphysics. And so I think that in each case we have to be very clear about that. And I agree as well that there are ways of taking particular work and then using it to address different concerns. Foucault's been very important for anti-colonial thought, for instance, and other such things. Foucault himself was a complicated figure. I mean, he said himself, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm a rebel, and a rebel who's not in the streets, which he actually was in the streets occasionally. So I think that you really have to have a more variegated analysis of all of that, and I just wouldn't want any one-to-one correlations. The last thing that I would say, though, is that there's, I think, particularly in the American Academy or the Anglo Academy, a kind of understanding that post-structuralism or deconstruction or whatever you want to call it introduced this higher mode of critique that then allowed for other political possibilities to happen that were largely invisible before that. Queer activism, queer practice didn't have to wait for Judith Butler to do what it's doing. Performance didn't have to wait to be named. And so I wouldn't want to give them too much power, and I'd want to understand how there are material practices that also need to be enfranchised as something that is quite radical. I don't know who, maybe since we're talking a lot about the left, why don't we start at the extreme right and work around?
Which is definitely where I see it.
Okay, good.
It's just worth noting, one of my favorite ones is the Dalai Lama had a regular, very generous CIA subsidy through the 70s and 80s.
Oh, not surprising.
Yeah, but I just wonder if there's something that's a little bit underemphasized in this account of what happened with the sort of French intellectual scene. I'm completely persuaded by this idea that there are sort of milieu of intellectual possibility that are conditioned by these kind of subterranean forces. But it strikes me that kind of and to return to the kind of standard myth, I guess, or narrative of 68, kind of the definitive factor for the French intellectual milieu going forward was the capitulation of the French Communist Party. I mean, that was
No, absolutely.
the definitive factor which caused intellectuals on the left to begin to formulate, be it, an account of biopower or micropolitics or whatever these kind of less than traditionally left traditions going forward. It's because the communists hobbled revolution, right when it was nearly there. So I wonder if...
No, that's a great, it's a really great point. And I think that's something that I need to integrate more clearly in Jennifer's kind of point about the importance of the critique of the left, by the left and for the left, also needs to then be articulated in relationship to the history of the Communist Party in France, in Italy, the other kind of major bastions, and the fact that the party had some really, really serious problems. And what I'd like to do, as I understand this book, is then have part of it be on, it works in French, the word play. It's critique de la gauche, oui, de la gauche. So it's critique of the left, yes, from the left. And the history of the critiques of the Communist Party, I won't go into the great details, but from Rosa Luxemburg to Castoriadis, to take two very important points, there's been a really radical critique of the party model that you have in Marxism as it manifests itself in communist organizations, and I think that's crucially important. And there's good contemporary work done on kind of critique of party politics versus organizations, for instance, and things like this. Yeah, so I think it's a great point. John?
Yeah, I have many questions, but I'm just going to focus on one. What do you make of subterranean histories inside of the radical left? For example, the fact that anarchism was totally buried by Marxism. Or another example is like the farmers' struggles was completely buried by factory workers' struggles.
Yeah. No, that's really great. And in fact, one of the things that's becoming increasingly clear in this project is that the Marxists were purged from the academy. The anarchists never got there. You could say the same for a lot of the black radical tradition in the States. And that there are a number of reasons for that, but that it's not as if there's just one consolidated left. There are attempts at burial within and bloody struggles between Marxists and anarchists, but also a way of then defining what the true radical left is. And part of what and this is, it's definitely things, or these are definitely things that I'm grappling with now, is given these various legacies how to rethink a broad cultural left today and to define it in terms that identify a strategic goal that is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and ecological, but that recognizes different tactics for doing that.
Yeah, the question of state.
Yeah, the question of state is crucially important. It's crucially important, and I'm not as convinced as some are that you have to choose to be a Marxist or be an anarchist, for instance, state or no state. I think there's great work and great examples of people who operate in different horizons than that. The indigenous tradition as well is one that's often subjected to subterranean. There's a lot of people interested in the black radical tradition and not in the radical indigenous movements within the United States would be. So I think that's a really good point and something for me to integrate. Yeah. Owen?
I wish we could just talk about that question for another hour. That's interesting. But,
Well, I think we can. It's just that we're going to have to get the wine
Yeah,
to
yeah,
continue
yeah.
the conversation.
I had a question that kind of built off some of what's being posed already in terms of more visible actors and how they relate to this kind of subterranean, which I think is quite fascinating, is the subterranean forces. And so I'm thinking, because there are a very wide variety of forces of selection and amplification of specific discourses and voices that go anywhere from, that wish to be named and wish to be known. So like all these grants that have important rich people's names on them. And notice when you move to the States, when I moved to the States from Canada, like professorships that are named after rich people. And,
Yeah. I'm hoping to get one of those someday. Give back a little.
The Art Institute of Chicago, which is organized around donors, not around art, and the big name on the, in every room. And so we're just taking the New York Times and their principles of selection and amplification, all quite visible. So I'm just wondering how you see those, quite advertised presence of selection of specific discourses and voices in relation to these more subterranean forces. And I think this goes back to your question a little bit too. I mean, I think that those forces all play a very important role in selecting what kinds of queer theory, the most non-threatening kinds. You don't see the most radical queer theorists, most radical theorists of anti-blackness in New York Times articles, or you're not going to see you're not going to see a lot of Facebook posts usually about like figures like Sylvia Federici or something. You see lots of other ones that. So there are many different principles of selection and trying to amplify the least threatening, most liberal versions of identity politics, of critiques coming from the left. And I'm just wondering how you see that in relation to the kind of subterranean forces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they operate at different levels. In the case of the New York Times, they have a long-standing history with the CIA. In fact, there's a family tie. I'd have to look through my notes for this, but there's also like the board of directors there's a kind of revolving door between the journalistic elite, the cultural elite in New York, and the Washington power brokers, where the people on the boards of trustees aren't just rich people. They are rich people who are in Washington and really the power elite. And so I think that they're not separate institutional matrices. Instead, they play different roles. And the role of the New York Times is the paper of record, which is to format and impose on the world the idea that leftism is liberalism. The Times is an interesting case because I submitted this article on the CIA to them, and I published other things with them that didn't reveal my political views. And they rejected it as being it was too specialized and required too much background concerning special operations. Maybe I should send it to a foreign policy magazine. This is because the New York Times has a sordid history with the CIA, and that it's a filter. And those types of filters are extremely important for legitimating and delegitimating discourses.
And art, right? And
Absolutely.
being a tastemaker.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. Others, maybe in the back.
Yeah, so I feel like we've been speaking a lot at this kind of level, capitalism versus anti-capitalism, and a couple of things that you've said is sort of tapped into this deeper values, goals level. For example, you said that the greatest conspiracy of all is the myth, or perhaps that's not the right word, that freedom and democracy is the highest goal of capitalist movements. It struck me that I'm not a scholar on American history, but it struck me that perhaps at some point freedom and democracy was the highest goal in American history, and that it's evolved such that now there might be the argument that it's not. So my question is to do with, at that value level, what do you see as the competing values that are going on underneath this capitalism versus anti-capitalism, left versus right kind of debate? And how does that fit with your research on subterranean forces and what's going on at this kind of more theoretical level?
I would say two things. One is that I am very dubious of a kind of inverted, this is the person who's bringing the wine. Let me just get a headphone out and I'll give him a quick call. So for the, there's a certain historical framework that resembles in many ways what we were talking about earlier with the time of the now, and whatever is now is really great and anything from the past is bad. The inverted version of that is the golden years, or the golden age. And you get that in particularly concerning democracy and the United States, especially now that, and it's really a terminology that I find quite repulsive, people talk about the Trump era or something along these lines. If you look at the history of America, and I've written extensively on this, but actually we're going to talk about it in the workshop because I have a book, Counter History of the Present, that I wrote in French but then put into English as well, there's a chapter on democracy and the history of democracy, and it's long and detailed, but basically it demonstrates the United States was not founded as a democracy, it was founded as a republic, which is an oligarchic, plutocratic mode of rule, opposed to democracy, explicitly opposed to democracy. All the founding fathers. The Constitutional Convention, the record is clear. The greatest threat to our Constitution is the democratic elements that are in the state constitutions. That's how the convention opens. And so I don't think that there were golden years. I think that what we have is a kind of oligarchic plutocracy founded by colonial property-owning white males from Europe who undertook a genocide of the indigenous population, enslaved the African population, subjugated women who had no political power, and subjugated the working class, and imperially took over the rest of the country by attacking and killing the Mexicans, and on and on and on. And I think that needs to be recognized. And so I don't see them as opposed. Now concerning, meaning I don't see it as, like, we're in this bad time now and there was a better time before. Concerning values that are undergirding, this would be a much broader conversation, but it's related to the project that I was working on before this project all of a sudden became the project, or the primary one that I'm working on. And that's a project on rethinking and reworking revolution, and part of that is on questions of normativity and values, and thinking values not in terms of transcendent norms that we would postulate, like freedom and equality, that are these great things that we all want, but instead norms that are immanently constituted out of communities that self-norm themselves. And so you don't need a transcendent account of values, that they're actually produced by particular societies, and that the battle becomes between values that are produced in our society, which are largely the values of the capitalist elite in the name of themselves, versus values that would redistribute the value of surplus value into something like the value of human life, or life more generally than just humans, or values of an equality, but that would be self-articulated and defined, so it doesn't become a kind of transcendent absolute of sorts. So there'd be a lot more to say about this. And I've got to call the guy back about the wine. But I can listen to a question while I'm looking for the next. I think, is it Ashley?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure that the name right.
Yeah, good job. Probably doing better than I am with names at this point today. So I actually wanted to come back to something in your response to Jasmine's question. She asked specifically about, like, let's say, the radical or revolutionary or insurrectionist effects of some of the post-structuralist discourse and philosophy.
Right.
And I think the question there gestures a little bit more toward the effect of theory rather than the individual political beliefs held by those who are writing the theory. And so I'm interested in pushing it a little bit farther. So who cares if Foucault conceives of himself as being a revolutionary or not, if there are people using his project and using his work toward revolutionary ends. And so I'm just a little bit more interested in both how you're conceiving of the relationship between, let's say, theorists and their theory, as well as, let's say, the political chronology or typology of counterposing or juxtaposing a certain Marxist social theory with a kind of post-structuralist social theory.
Okay.
So call the wine guy.
Well, I'm texting him and trying to multitask, so correct me if I haven't understood all the nuances, but two things come to mind immediately. One is that I don't want a simple correlation because I don't think there is one. Politics is a multidimensional phenomenon. And someone like Foucault, for instance, if we just take this example, he had different politics at different times. Some of his politics were quite in tension with, they're rife with certain contradictions that one could point out. And that being said, I don't think that it's easy to distinguish someone's political action from their intellectual production, at least insofar as those are bound up with particular social practices. And say, it reminds me of this famous Picasso quote, who, in talking about, Picasso talking about the work that he was doing during World War II, he said, it's not like you're a boxer who just works on his muscles or her muscles, or you're a painter and all you do is interact with the paint. No, you're a person in the world. And as a person in the world, one of the things that you do is paint or box, for instance, but that these cannot be fully disentangled from one another. And I do think that that's important. Are there uses that are made of someone like Foucault? Yeah, there are a million uses, and abuses, of course, of them in various ways. Foucault, I think, is a particularly interesting case because he is probably, particularly in the Anglophone intellectual community, a real touchstone for a whole series of different, queer theory, but also decolonial theory, biopolitics, prison debates. He's very vast in his various reaches. And I do think that it's quite interesting that the way in which he articulates not just his own politics, but the project that he does of a kind of genealogical diagnostic, if you will, of modern power relations, is such that the relationship between political transformation is not, I would say, at least explicitly formulated in terms of an anti-capitalist orientation that is premised upon dismantling the conquest. The conquest is the last 500 years of European capitalism demolishing the rest of the world. And you see that in his Eurocentrism, you see it in his a whole series of different aspects of his work. So I think that we'd have to have a longer conversation then about these individual figures and then how they relate to particular movements. And Foucault, I think, would probably be the most interesting person in that regard because of the impact that he's had. And so the position that I'm taking is not one of denying that or not saying there aren't resources in Foucault for thinking these things. Foucault's been enormous in my own intellectual work, enormous. But also then thinking through what those politics are and recognizing the fact that he regularly makes statements that are directly in line with what Castoriadis calls the blackmail of the gulag. You try to change the social system and the economic system, and blood is going to run in the streets. That's the blackmail of the gulag. It's a blackmail because as soon as you think about really radically transforming society, you're going to run into problems. That's an ideological trope that is part of the Cold War era that the CIA definitely promoted, and it's part of what the new philosophers promoted, and Foucault defended the new philosophers who took that position. Sorry, these are really great questions. I want to Yeta, and we'll work our way around, I guess.
So I have a question. A few elements of the discussion echo, at least for me, kind of theories on propaganda. And I'm curious if there is a purpose, if there's a reason why you're avoiding that language. especially in questions of how you separated the...
Avoiding what language? I'm sorry.
Of propaganda.
Propaganda, yeah, yeah.
Especially, and maybe you discuss this somewhere else or in the book project overall, especially because there's at least two elements that are very prominent in theories of propaganda. One is this question of the relationship between visibility and invisibility
Yeah.
as actually like mechanisms of propaganda, and the other
Yeah.
one, the military and the analyst branch, and usually they're spoken of, I think, more in terms of ideology rather than
Yeah.
this analyst language. So I'm just curious if there's like a strategic reason why you're avoiding that language, or if you see something here that's very different from propaganda.
Just a lack of time.
Lack of time, okay.
Because propaganda is essential. In fact, one of the things I'm trying to figure out in this project, and it's a great question because it goes to the heart of it, is how also the counter history of the 20th century is necessitated by the emergence of propaganda in its full form, which is a phenomenon of the 20th century. The whole story of Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Freud, who used psychoanalytic tools and mobilized them for advertising and marketing, and the fact that another way of thinking about the company is it's an enormous PR firm, an enormous propaganda firm. That's what the cultural warfare is all about. And that terminology, I think, is very important because it goes to the heart of, I think, one of the major struggles of the long 20th century is, for better or worse, you do have the rise of mass democracies. They're not really democracies as democracy has been historically defined, but they're mass forms of what some people call 60-second democracy, where you get to vote for candidates that you haven't chosen once every 4 or 5 years. And that more and more people have the franchise, even though there's an assault on voting rights, but it's still something that the powers that be have to grapple with. That rise in mass democracy has gone hand in hand with the rise of corporatocracy in the long 20th century. And so that one of the conundrums is, how can corporate power within mass democracy mobilize its power in order to keep the people in their place? And propaganda is the answer to that. Not propaganda in the naive sense of the term, like we're just going to try to sell you some toothpaste here, but propaganda in the profound sense of the term, because the best propaganda is propaganda that you never see. It's propaganda that you innately believe in because it's how you've been formatted as a subject, it's your worldview. And so thank you for the question. No, it really goes to the heart of, and what they call, and I love this terminology, it's psychological warfare. That's their term. They're not messing around. This isn't like, oh, we'll just, provide a different image of the world. It's psychological warfare. Yeah. If anyone really needs some air and really needs some wine, Jennifer just went down to see if to help facilitate that. So don't hesitate. But I know there are a few more questions or comments.
Yeah.
And then we'll wrap up and take a break.
So does she need help bringing stuff up? Is that what you're saying?
She might. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but thank you, Jasmine. I knew I could count on you.
So I have 2 questions. One is an echo of Jasmine's and Ashley's, and it's about the story that you gave about post-structuralism, not so much invested
About?
Post-structuralism.
Yeah.
Not so much invested on the authors themselves, but in terms of which trajectories of reception, when we tell this story, we emphasize. And
Yeah.
of course, there is Foucault, and as happens in your work, but in other contexts, have been read as not disconnected from an anti-capitalist
Of course, yeah.
Marxist. In the Italian autonomista, the Latin American colonial school, is actually a liberal Foucault that is like a myth, or like that doesn't exist in the theories. So that leads me, so there's one question, and it's about if perhaps the whole discourse that you're criticizing, not to sound too critical, but it's not being reproduced into like this is the Foucault and like this is the CIA Foucault and other Foucaults or other post-structural, other Derridas
Don't exist or something like that. Yeah.
Are not like today doing awesome work in broadening that left is still committed to anti-capitalism. Okay, so this is one question.
Yeah.
The second one has to do with the subterranean history, and here I'm going to echo your concerns with anarchism, or perhaps other subjects of history that were within leftist like vision, worldview of history disavowed as the present. and the kind of work that the subaltern studies tradition, for example, did.
The what?
Subaltern studies.
Okay, yeah.
Like that, with regards to history, of calling history 1 and history 2 in the case of Chakravarti, like of analyzing subterranean, perhaps in still anti-capital, still coming from Marxist traditions, but realizing that there was something about that history that still needed to account for what was silenced in them. And here I want you to perhaps elaborate on what you're calling in the subterranean history the desire not to be or not to have a name or not, I don't know, a kind of what I identify as a desire for anonymity.
Mm-hmm.
Because I sort of understand that desire when it gets co-opted into this individualizing like heroes and stuff like that. But there's another sense in which like confronting anonymity by renaming sites, even when it has to a potential heroic dimension, it has the opposite effect. And I was thinking here, Asata Shakur's autobiography, like that you name a character and you heroize a character, but you do it within a very radical, like not disembedding that individual from larger context and social. So I'm wondering about that desirability of not being the hero of history, the heroine of history. If you can qualify that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's both of those are great. On the first question, I couldn't agree more. In fact, I've in many ways argued something very similar in relationship to cultural production. I think that when we think of the politicity, so the various political dimensions, not just politics in the singular, of cultural production, then we need to account for its production, its circulation, and its reception. And at the reception of cultural production is part of its politicity. So you take someone like Deleuze, for instance, who is also quite explicitly anti-capitalist. And I think there are very important differences between Foucault and Deleuze on that front, even though they were friends and wrote together and whatnot. What that means is that we have to have a variegated analysis of the different receptions, and not receptions as there's the purity of the text, and then there are different interpretations, but that the reception is the social life of the cultural product itself. And so I think your point is very, very well taken, that in this project it's important not to give too much power to one reception, which would be that of the company, for instance. Regarding the second question on subterranean history, I think that what's really unique about this kind of anonymous history is that there's a goal to remain water. That's all we got. Okay.
Magicians?
There's a table in the back of the room if you want to put stuff back there. Thank you so much. There's a way in which the goal is to remain anonymous in order to be the meta hero of history. It's not getting rid of the heroism of it. It's to remain invisible precisely in order to have that much more power and impact. And that's a very different thing. And so I also didn't mean to suggest, I think that and you see this in the radical left tradition, I do think that there are important modes of hero worship that can be operative because they allow for leverage in particular ways. If you see the Zapatistas play off of this by actually kind of constructing heroes and myths around heroes so that people have something to latch onto, and you can situate those heroes within particular narratives. And I think there is power to that. Part of this project, and it's increasingly clear actually in the conversation that we're having, is also about the political power of narrative and how there are certain stories that allow for modes of political agency and others that foreclose them. And so I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, but I do think that there are forms of using heroic structures in a way that can be extremely beneficial as well, and helpful, because in political activism as well, if you're constantly saying, oh, it's much more complicated than that, there are all of these actors, we need a multivectorial analysis, then sometimes you can't just tell a story and say, no, these are the people, this is what they want, this is their leader, their group of leaders, or their charismatic spokesperson, or whatever it might be. And there is power, I think there's tactical power in doing precisely that. Yeah. Are there other, now that the wine's here, everybody's probably like, no, I don't have a question. Yeah.
I just have a kind of dovetailing on the question of the subterranean history. And not only insofar as the choice of that term to uncover, you know, power with a capital P as opposed to, say, like, mass move, which I think was kind of, you were gesturing towards, if I understood you correctly. But also thinking about the question of anonymity, which in the case of the CIA is a, you know, choice of repression, of self-repression. And then if, you know, part of the question is about, as I'm understanding it, also the construction of an ideology, right? So how do you, almost isomorphically to the repression, there's also, you know, the way in which we're all, you know, unbeknownst to us or beknownst to us, you know, participating in the habitus of capital and imperialism all the time, right? And, you know, we're all imbricated in capitalism nonetheless, in some sense, right? So I'm just wondering if that figure of anonymity or subterranean has actually quite, you know, quite a lot, it can kind of be exploded in the sense that.
How so? Yeah.
In the sense that.
Oh, that we're all actors in it, or
that there are modes of kind of that. How do we? So sure. I mean, there's this. We can uncover this, and I'm extremely convinced by this narrative that, and you know, history that there's, you know, and we've seen this in Latin America quite a bit, right? That the CIA quite presently, there are, you know, physical people who are paid by the CIA to go and, you know, support certain cultural actors, not to mention, right, like hard power, right? Like, and who are also producing certain receptions. So Jackson Pollock is like the liberal, you know, masturbating on the painting kind of thing. But I'm also wondering if the question of a subterranean history can also be about a kind of reflexive mode of thinking about the way in which kind of us intellectuals or the multitude itself participates in the reconstruction of imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, you know, gender binaries, etc.
Yeah. No, that's really great, and so it's a perfect question to wrap up on. So I would say that there are ways in which, when I was talking to Ian earlier about having a kind of multi-agential approach, I don't think that the model of agency that identifies individuals as sole actors is sufficient, because there's a multiplicity of agencies that's operative within each of us. And even the vocabulary within each of us is quite complicated because it presupposes some type of nodal point. I think we're a meeting point between different agential fields that intersect with other agential fields, to the extent that a we or an I is highly problematized in that regard. And so that there are certain modalities of agency that absolutely are embedded within these broader structures of power relations that are anonymous even unto ourselves, because they're the way in which we're forged as cultural producers or as subjects in the world. And that the subterranean, that's what I really like about your invitation to think in these terms, is how I was presenting it earlier sounded like there's the general history that everybody tends to tell, and then there's the cave that I want to go down into in order to reveal how that world is actually just a set of, it's a stage, to mix metaphors. But in fact, the subterranean is not just that, because that externalizes it and makes it seem as if, oh, there's just history that's out there. But actually the subterranean's also inside of us. And that's the really difficult part of it, is that there are anonymous dimensions to historical agency that have been sedimented within ourselves and formatted us in terms of what we were saying earlier. Even we could relate it back to the vocabulary of a habitus, in which our worldviews are not just our worldviews. And that is really part of the core of the problem, is recognizing the perpetuation of anonymous worldviews that you think are yours. And the reason that they're put there is due to a deep cultural history and education, you know, what standard Marxists would just call ideology, but I think actually operates very complexly and can't be reduced to some standard models of ideology that are operative. And then the kind of theoretical project would be one of a dual excavation. An excavation of history, but also an excavation of oneself. A kind of internal ethnology that reveals the sedimented anonymous structures that have produced our own worldviews. And thank you, and it's a perfect place to conclude, because it's also just a very, very poignant comment, because in a weird way, I didn't think that I'd be, like, I have a background in French philosophy and art and politics and have worked on these things. I didn't think I was going to be doing a book on the CIA. But one of the things that your comment really points to is what's pulled me in is the recognition of the extent to which my own worldview has been so deeply formatted by an intergenerational assault on the radical cultural left in ways that I was completely unaware of. And that part of this is a bit of a Bildungsroman. It's an exploration of the sedimented aspects of my own intellectual dispositions that are anonymous. The covert operation is happening within all of us. So, why don't we, thank you very much. This was a delightful conversation, and I hope to continue the delightful conversation. Thank you.